Tonight we're continuing to look at the Canon of Scripture, the list of books in our Bible, and why we can be confident that we have the right ones. We're looking tonight at some of what are sometimes called the lost books of the Bible, books that some people claim should be in the Bible, and yet they're not. And the ones we're going to look at tonight are ones that are written by a group called the Gnostics. Their religion is called Gnosticism. When we look at this word Gnosticism or Gnostic, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, or it's a special type of knowledge. And so this term for them was not something that they made up for themselves. It was actually given to them in the 18th century, much, much later than when they were writing. But it was given when they were studying about these ancient writings, and so it refers to a diverse group of people. So they don't all agree about everything. I mean, they made up a lot of things. So if you have people making things up, they're not going to agree on everything. But they certainly did not agree with the Orthodox Christianity, or we could say with the Bible itself. And so they put great emphasis on having secret knowledge of spiritual things. So that's where that name Gnostic comes from, because they emphasized secret knowledge so much. So in the Bible, we actually have some of the ideas that they had very commonly among them, spoken about and against. So Gnosticism was developed mainly around the 2nd century. So not in the 1st century when the Bible was being written, but even so, even though it came a little bit later in the 2nd century, the New Testament was still strongly arguing against some of the core ideas that would become part of the Gnostic belief. And one of them that maybe isn't directly tied in, but I think definitely applies, is in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verses 20 and 21, where Paul tells Timothy, "O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid irreverent, empty chatter and the opposing arguments of so-called knowledge, which some have professed and thus swerved away from the faith. Grace be with you all." So he told Timothy that there were people making empty, irreverent things and opposing arguments of using what they claimed was knowledge, but it really wasn't knowledge because it wasn't true. And this idea of secret knowledge being so important is something that was very important in this Gnostic doctrine and in these books that we're going to talk about. But with Timothy, Paul tells him he had learned these things in the presence of many witnesses. This is in 2 Timothy 2. He tells him to entrust it to other faithful men and women, other faithful people who would be able to teach others also. It wasn't intended to be secret knowledge, and it's something that's intended for everyone to know. In 1 John chapter 4, we have something a bit more specific that is very common among these teachings. And so 1 John 4, verse 1 through 3 says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God, and every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now already in the world." So he says that there are those who are claiming that Jesus did not come in the flesh, and that is not of God. That's not inspired. If it's written down and it says something like that, it cannot be inspired by the Spirit of God. It does not belong in the Bible. And yet these Gnostic books, not all of them make it clear that Jesus did not come in the flesh, but the basic idea in Gnosticism is that the flesh is evil. Everything physical is evil, and so a good God could not be part of that. He could not actually come in the flesh. And so they taught things like Jesus just came as a spirit, but he looked like a man, things like that. And they don't believe in the actual death and resurrection of Jesus. They would make that into some spiritual idea, or sometimes they would, regarding the crucifixion, they would argue that someone else died on that cross, not Jesus, because he couldn't. He was not in the flesh. And so in 2 John 1, verse 7, he talks about this again. He says, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world, refusing to confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist." So it's very clear that that particular doctrine, which is not unique to Gnosticism, but was part of the Gnostic teaching, it is definitely not from Christ. It's not from God, and any book that would teach that cannot be inspired by God. So the first things that we knew about Gnosticism, at least in later times, is from the writing of what are called the Church Fathers. So these are early people writing on to each other, people who claim to be Christians. Maybe some of them were. I don't know too much about it to judge whether they're Christians or not, but they certainly believed they were. And they wrote a lot of good things. Some of them were not so good as well. But they actively wrote against the ideas that the Gnostic groups were circulating, that they were writing and teaching. And so for quite a long time, their writings were the primary source of information that modern scholars had about Gnosticism. Irenaeus, who wrote, or who lived at least, between around 130 to 202 AD, so 2nd century, just not that long after the apostles, he wrote something called Against the Heresies, which is something that was pretty much dedicated to combating Gnostic teachings. So these are some of the things that people knew about the Gnostics, but they didn't actually have anything that the Gnostics had written. That had disappeared because the Christians rejected it. They did not pass it around and keep it, and so they disappeared. They were lost. But in 1945, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, they found, preserved, because it's Egypt and it's the desert and all of that, they were able to find 52 Gnostic writings. I think they were in about 13 codices, which are kind of like books. And so they had 52 different writings from the Gnostics that they found. This is just in 1945. And so these included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John, which is also called the Apocryphon of John. Even though they discovered these in 1945, they're actually from the 2nd to the 4th centuries. That's when they would have been written. A common theme in all of these 52 writings would be the emphasis on the inherent evil of the physical or material world, so that everything physical is evil, and the idea that salvation comes through secret esoteric knowledge. And esoteric, I had to look that up, but it's intended to be understood by only a small group. So it's a specialized knowledge. It's a synonym for mysterious. So that's the idea of esoteric, but that's the type of knowledge that this is. It's not just general knowledge that everybody should know, that they're trying to teach everyone. It's a secret knowledge that only a few know, and they believe that they will be saved through that special knowledge. And not through the sacrifice of Jesus, because they don't believe that actually happened, right? Because he didn't come in the flesh, according to them. So why are these books not included in the Bible? Well, they were written after the 1st century, so they're outside the time of the apostles. They're outside of the time of the period of biblical inspiration, so they couldn't be inspired by God just because of timing. But also, the authors are not qualified, largely because of that, but even some of them claim to be written by apostles like Thomas or Peter, sometimes other known disciples like James the Just. That's what they called the brother of Jesus. Just about everybody who studies these things knows that those are not the ones who actually wrote these books. It's very clear that they are not the authors, especially ones who wrote other books in the Bible and that don't look anything like these books. They teach very, very different things. And that's the biggest thing, is that they have contradictory doctrines. And anything inspired by God is going to agree with other things inspired by God. And so they have very fundamentally different ideas from what is in the established scriptures, the things we know that are from God. And so some of these things that they teach is that the material world, why is it evil? Well, it was created by a God who is not the high God, the good, true God overall, but a lesser, often ignorant or evil God called the demiurge. You don't have to know that, but that's what they called him, and it's distinct from the true high God that Jesus represents. And then there's this idea of Docetism. Again, you don't have to know that term, but that's just the idea that Jesus did not have a physical body or suffer in the flesh. He just appeared to be human. So that's a separate teaching from Gnosticism, but it's included in Gnosticism. And that's what John specifically argued against. And then they also portrayed that Jesus was primarily a revealer of secret knowledge necessary for salvation instead of saving through his sacrificial death and resurrection. All right, so I want us to then look at some of these examples. I've talked about them, but I want you to just see a few parts of them to get an idea of why these are not in our Bibles. Because if you watch TV when they have documentaries about these things, or you listen to social media, that sort of thing, though it sounds like these are just, very good religious texts that belong in the Bible, and it's just because people didn't like what they said that they got left out. Well, here's what the Apocryphon of James starts with. So this is supposed to be James, the brother of Jesus, writing this. And he says, "Since you asked that I send you a secret book, which was revealed to me and Peter by the Lord, I could not turn you away or gainsay," and then there's some missing text there, but I have written it in the Hebrew alphabet, as if that matters, and sent it to you, and you alone. But you see how there's that emphasis on secret knowledge. It's just for you. It was just to us, and now it's just to you. And then, "But since you are a minister of the salvation of the saints, endeavor earnestly and take care not to rehearse this text to many, that the Savior did not wish to tell to all of us, his 12 disciples, but blessed will they be who will be saved through the faith of this discourse." So he says, okay, first of all, it was only Peter and me that the Lord taught this to, and I'm writing it to you alone. Now you're a preacher, but take care not to preach it to very many people. Can you imagine Jesus teaching something like that? That just doesn't fit at all with the way Jesus taught. He says, teach it to the whole world, right? Preach to every creation, every creature under heaven, right? But they're saying just teach it to a few people, because he didn't even teach it to all of his 12 disciples. So Peter and James had special knowledge the rest of the disciples, the apostles, did not have, according to this. And he says that those who have faith in what he's writing here will be saved through that. Not through what Jesus has done, not through faith in Jesus, but through faith in this special secret knowledge. All right, so that's just the introduction to that book. You could read the whole thing if you want. It's available on the internet, but the rest of it is nonsense as well. The Gospel of Thomas is it's actually just a collection of quotations from Jesus, or what they claim are quotations from Jesus. So it's almost like Proverbs in the sense that they're very disconnected. It's not a story, but here are some of them. that I just selected out of it. One of them is that he said, "He who shall find the interpretation of the words shall not taste of death." So it's about this special knowledge being what saves you. It's not about obedience or anything like that. In fact, they didn't do much about telling you what to do. The secret knowledge wasn't about that. It's just about special knowledge about creation and the God who's over all and has nothing to do with physical things. And then there's the evil God and all of those sorts of things. That's the special knowledge. It's not about your behavior at all. So this would appeal to people who didn't want to change their behavior. Another one is that the disciples said to Jesus, "We know that thou wilt go from us. Who is he who shall be great over us?" Jesus said to them, "In the place to which you come, you shall go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." So they say, well, who's going to be the greatest one over us? Of course, we know the answer. The real answer to that is, if you want to be greatest, be the servant to all, right? That's the answer Jesus actually gave. But here, Jesus says, James the just, his brother, James, is the one who's going to be great over you all. And it's for his sake, for James' sake, that heaven and earth came into being, which I don't know what that's supposed to mean, especially since they say heaven and earth is evil. But anyway, they can't really be consistent. Another one that is maybe the most ridiculous one, Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go forth from among us, for women are not worthy of the life." Jesus said, "Behold, I shall lead her, that I may make her male, in order that she also may become a living spirit like you males. For every woman who makes herself male shall enter into the kingdom of heaven." So this is just nonsense. Women not being living spirits, that's ridiculous. And becoming a male doesn't make any sense. A woman can't become male. Anyway, this is just total rubbish. And you can see why this does not belong in the Bible. The Apocryphon of John, or the secret message of John, he has in here a teaching about how this evil God, he gives him three names, how he's the creator, and he says he is impious in his arrogance which is in him, for he said, "I am God and there is no other God beside me," which he's quoting from the Old Testament, right? And he's saying that's impious and arrogant for him to say that. He also quotes him when he says, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." And then he says, but by announcing this, he indicated to the angels who attended him that there exists another God, for if there were no other one, of whom would he be jealous? You see their reasoning there. But of course, God was talking about idols, right? When he says, "I'm a jealous God," and there is no other God. That is true. He's jealous of them going after idols, which are not gods at all. But they twisted this into saying there's another God, this higher God, and he was just lying when he said there's no other God beside me. And he talks about him creating man and how the angels, different angels created different parts of the man. It's just nonsense. But that's that secret knowledge that they claimed they had about all of this. It's really blasphemous. So it definitely does not belong in the Bible. The hypostasis of the archons, that's a great name, the reality of the rulers. In this one, it's very similar, talking about this evil God who's the creator. And again, it says he was ignorant and arrogant, claiming to be God with none other than him. It even says he sinned in saying that. And then it talks about them creating Adam and then Eve. And it even talks about these authorities that, God, the God of the Old Testament is chief of, chasing after Eve in order to, have their way with her. And she turns into a tree. And then the snake comes, and the snake is the instructor. And it seems like the way it talks about the snake is actually the one that's right. So it's a lot of nonsense. And that's why it's not in the Bible. So the Gnostics, they followed an idea that apostles had directly spoken against. They taught that there were special few that were saved by knowing something that was kept secret from everyone else. They taught that there was more than one God, including the idea that the creator was an evil God or stupid. It's blasphemy. And they mostly just taught nonsense. And so the Christians who were there at the time rejected their writings for a very good reason, and we should also reject them. So when we talk about the canon of Scripture and the books that belong in the Bible, these definitely don't. If you're talking about the lost books of the Bible and including these do not belong. We'll try to talk another time about other lost books or so-called lost books of the Bible. But for this whole group of books, they definitely don't belong, and we can be sure of it just by reading them. All right, well, that's the class for tonight. Thank you.